Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization. Today's video is about growing your spinal erectors. I'll wait for you to say all the jokes. All right, now that we've gotten those jokes out, if you don't have them all out, just put them in the comments. I'm sure there are some good ones. Here's the thing. Tips for back growth training are super common, and later on, we've already had a bunch and we have videos, and later on we'll have way more. But usually those tips are focused on the lats. As a matter of fact, a huge pet peeve of mine is people using back and lats reflexively. Those lats are maybe like 1/4 of your back. Maybe the mid-traps and rhomboids are mentioned, but rarely are spinal erectors mentioned. And the thing is, they can be huge and gnarly, and they can be an enormous part of your back, and they are the core of your all-around strength. It actually turns out that there was at least one study back in the day in which sort of upper spinal erector thickness was the most predictive variable for how strong someone was in powerlifting, believe it or not, which makes sense. Like a strong back goes a long, long way. So let's look at some tips on building them. Before that, I have some pictures to throw up here. One of them on the left is of me with my right spinal erector actually reaching out from behind my left one. It's kind of a freaky picture. Big spinal erectors look cool. And then to make me look like I don't train is Johnny Jackson there on the right with spinal erectors that don't make any goddamn sense at all. It's a neat look. It's a neat look. Yeah, sure, Johnny's traps and lats are cool too, but without spinal erectors, there's something missing from that gnarly, huge back look. Now, training tips. I've got 5 of them, and you can start them tomorrow and be on your way to bigger erectors. You thought I was going to say something else. Here we go. Tip number 1. In my experience, not much replaces years of deadlifts. I've done tons and literally like 2 decades of deadlifting, a lot of sets of 5 to 10. Conventional is ideal because it taxes the spinal erectors more than sumo, and working up to be real strong for sets of 5 to 10 with very good stable technique. That will slap the meat on your spinal erectors like very few things will. Next, do plenty of heavy rowing, stiff-legged deadlifts, and good mornings because they require your spinal erectors to act as usually static stabilizers, supporting enormous loads, and that drives a lot of hypertrophy to those muscles. And really, heavy rowing should be a part, or at least rowing of some number of reps, should be a part of your back training anyway. And the core of your hamstring training and posterior chain training should be some variations of good mornings and stuff like deadlifts anyway, but it really spills over into giant erectors. You show me someone who has grown impressive hamstrings doing lots of good mornings and stiff legged deadlifts, and I'll show you someone who probably has awesome spinal erectors in addition to that. Versus if you just do a lot of leg curls, you can get really big hamstrings. Spinal erectors could be left a little bit lagging. Point number 3, you want to bend over a lot in your rows. That doesn't mean you round over in your rows. That means you bend over to 90 degrees or close, somewhere between sort of 45 and 90. You don't want to be up here. If you bend over a lot, but you keep your mid-back either arched or flat, that sheer amount of tension that has to be exerted by your spinal erectors to keep you in that position, first of all, it's a great position for the rest of your back. Huge range of motion, big stretch, big stimulus for the lats and all the other muscles, but also enormous stimulus for the spinal erectors just from bending over real far. You can tell someone has weak erectors if their preferred rowing angles, like right here, the upright bent over row, and you're like, hey, bend over further, and they just go absolutely nowhere and collapse. You're like, okay, this is a real big problem. Point number 4, at least on some of your machine back training, even if you have a chest support, going into proactive flexion of your spine, and at the end, extension. So you basically let your chest and shoulders be rounded over, and then at the top, you squeeze and arch and contract and lift your chest as high as possible, squeezing your shoulder blades back. So your spine goes from looking like this at the bottom of the row to like this at the top of the row. That is actually a dynamic training of the spinal erectors. Notice everything else here really is kind of static training, which is not as optimal as dynamic training, but because the loads are so massive and all those other things, your spinal erectors will be golden. But just to add in that little extra bit, if you do some movement at the spine for chest supported rows, they're super, super safe, especially if you work up. It can fry your spinal erectors and help make them that much bigger. Lastly, taking all these tips together, please keep an eye on your fatigue. Axial fatigue, the fatigue of what essentially your spine is feeling compression-wise and all the other forces, is a huge, big deal. It's very easy to do a lot of exercises that tax your spinal erectors and get crazy overreached and experience declines in deadlift performance, squat performance, just feeling like a human being, just feel weak all the time. Typically, your erectors are involved in almost every movement you do, kind of in all of life. So they have a high maximum recoverable volume, but a lot of that is eaten up by just daily activities and every other kind of training you do. So you have to make sure to find your volume tolerance for spinal erectors well, and not just simply think more is better. Find what works for you based on rep strength. If your rep strength and all your movements that involve spinal erectors are still going up or stable, you're good to go. The answer is do that volume or even try a little more. If it starts to go down on you and too much fatigue, you know you've hit your top end volume or your top end number of microcycles of really serious erector training, and then you have to bring it back down because high fatigue training is good for nobody. Folks, enjoy having a bigger back and also a big erection. I said it. See you next time.